Once you realize what is required in order to view a sample under the electron microscope, you may not be so quick to accept the dots and squiggly lines as sufficient proof for the existence of these mythological beasts known as viruses.
Disappear one day, it's like a miracle, it will disappear.
Because coronavirus isn't going away, it's going to be endemic, it's going to be in our population.
Disappear one day, it's like a miracle, it will disappear.
And my wife is not going to immunize our kids. It'll ultimately be the warm weather, which is hopefully going to slow it down a lot, and the vaccine, which we'll have in 6 months, which will knock it back. My wife is not going to immunize our kids. My wife is not going to immunize our kids. Because I've got 4 of them, and when I go home, I'm not Dr. Oz, I'm Mr. Oz.
We trusted the scientists back in 1976 with the original swine flu shot, and a lot of people got sick. Right. Not only that, some people died, some people were paralyzed. From the shot itself. And people remember the swine flu vaccine as a terrible disaster.
But this is one time. Forget the conspiracy. Listen to our government agencies. These guys are telling the truth. You know, there's no conspiracy here, folks. Just get your damn vaccine. Just get your damn vaccine. Just get your damn vaccine.
Not only that, some people died, some people were paralyzed. From the shot itself. And people remember the swine flu vaccine as a terrible disaster.
Disappear one day, it's like a miracle, it will disappear.
So we've talked to the people here in Utah that have gotten it. Well, they're not here in Utah right now, but have gotten it. They said, well, I felt fine, you know, the whole time.
What's tricky about this virus is oftentimes symptoms are so subtle you don't even know you have it when you're contagious.
Spread by people without symptoms?
That's a major concern, David. You've seen people coming into the United States at airports being tested for having a fever. Well, the big concern here is all the people who don't show any symptoms who could still pass along the coronavirus to other people.
Disappear one day, it's like a miracle, it will disappear.
What I've directed the CDC to do is that as soon as somebody is diagnosed with Ebola, we want a rapid response team, a SWAT team, essentially, from the CDC to be on the ground as quickly as possible.
A virus becomes contagious when the temperature, acidity, and genetic and protein environments are favorable. To colonize a different host, the virus must adapt itself to the new conditions by mutating. What scientists fear most is that a virus of animal origin, such as the avian flu virus, and a virus of human origin infect the same cell. Their genetic material would then combine to produce thousands of hybrid viruses. These mutants, equipped with new camouflage systems and new weapons, could become true killers in humans.
Once you realize what is required in order to view a sample under the electron microscope, you may not be so quick to accept the dots and squiggly lines as sufficient proof for the existence of these mythological beasts known as viruses. Number one is the power of the electron beam that is used, which destroys all living cells. Number two is the vacuum required for it to function, which immediately evaporates any water and would vaporize a biological sample. And number three is that all samples in transmission and scanning electron microscopes must be coated with a thin layer of metal, usually gold or gold palladium. This makes the sample conductive. And so the virus, too small to be visible under any optical microscope, can be located, captured, secured, have the water removed, and coated with metal for the finished product of a dot or squiggly line. That is unbelievable. That is unbelievable. And here is how the experts describe the process.
It's quite important to be very open-minded about what you're going to say.
Process.
It's quite important to be very open-minded about what you're going to say. It's quite important to be very open-minded about what you're going to say. You need to make sure what you're looking at is actually real. You need to make sure what you're looking at is actually real. So you can get quite a few artifacts, anything from dust that's fallen on your sample, which can look like a piece of sample. You can get some cracking in the vacuum, so you actually get cracks forming in your sample, which are not there, they've been caused by the microscope. Sometimes the coating can cause artefacts. If you coat too thickly, you can start to see the metal particles. And of course, if you're looking for small particles, they can look just like your sample might look like. Of course, if you're looking for small particles, they can look just like your sample might look like.
The environment inside an electron microscope is incredibly hostile to the living cell. The environment inside an electron microscope is incredibly hostile to the living cell, so it needs to go through quite an elaborate process to enable it to survive that hostile environment. Firstly, we have a very high vacuum, and if you stick biological samples into a vacuum, they'll just escape very quickly and be destroyed. We have a very high energy electron beam which is required to be able to penetrate the sample. When the electron beam strikes the sample, it gets very, very hot. It can get up to 150 degrees Celsius. Where the electron beam actually hits the sample. So it needs to be able to survive that very high temperature.
Usually the way to tell if something's an artifact is just from experience. So spending a lot of time looking at a whole lot of different samples, you'll see these things continually appearing.
Some of the important things to think about when you're interpreting data from the microscope is, do you understand your sample well enough to be able to interpret what you're seeing? There's just a lot of information. In fact, you could almost say that you're going to be overwhelmed by information when you get to the ultrastructural level. And unless you really know your sample well, then this information could actually be misleading. Do you have enough experience with the particular technique you're working to know what has gone on during the preparation of the sample and how it may have altered your sample? You also need to think very carefully about, have you introduced bias into the way you collected your sample? You may have tended to look for pretty areas rather than areas that are scientifically relevant.
Spatter coating is popping a really thin layer of metal on top of our sample surface. The layer we'd use is between 1 and 10 nanometers, so it's nice and thin. It's not going to cover up any of the sample, but it's going to add a nice wee layer so the sample becomes conductive. If the sample's not conductive, we won't see anything. So what will happen is the electrons that land on the sample and go through the sample can't get away to Earth, so they build up inside the sample and cause artefacts, which we call charging. So we'd get our sample, attach it to a holder so it's attached quite firmly. We'd load it into the spatter coater, shut everything up and create quite a high vacuum in the coater. We would then pass a voltage over the top of the coater where the metal target is sitting, and that creates a little electric field inside the coater itself. We then bleed gas into the chamber. The gas molecules get all excited and they kind of hoon around and knock little bits of the target material off. So those little bits of the target also move around inside the chamber quite randomly, and they find their way and land on top of the sample, creating quite a thin layer.
If you say, I don't even think viruses exist, they may think you're completely off your rocker. So it's actually that ingrained in us that these viruses exist. And that's how important it is that we be honest with ourselves and we look at everything with objective eyes and we say, okay, you're trying to give me medication or a vaccine or this or that. Well, prove to me that you even have isolated a virus, that you even know what a virus is, that this virus actually exists as you present it. You know, there's a book by Klaus Conlin, and it's titled, How the Medical Industry Continually Invents Epidemics, Making billion-dollar profits at our expense. And he shows that the alleged contagious viruses are just, in fact, particles produced by the cells themselves as a consequence of certain stress factors. So there's a lot of information out there. We need to discover a lot more information.
While smallpox may be the most deadly virus of the 20th century, there are other microscopic killers that hold impressive numbers of victims. In the war against viruses, man is trying to build up an efficient arsenal of defense. A race against time has truly begun. Each mutation is like a new secret weapon against which we must learn to defend ourselves. For more than a century, modern virology has been taking giant steps forward in vaccine research.
What they sell us, or what they sold the world as being viral particles, are not viral particles. And you're just going to borrow you the latest issue of Scientific American, and there you will find on page 50 the explanation what they are showing to us. Cellular particles for export, import of proteins and other materials produced by certain cells, and they look exactly the same what they're showing us as HIV. So this is one explanation for what we see in those electron micrographs. And on a molecular level, they detect HIV only by indirect means. They say if you are positive, it means if you have antibody against some proteins, you are positive. But it's a clear circular argument because they have no viral proteins. They just come up using proteins which in the mixture of those cells and those cells were prepared under severe conditions, isolating the proteins without showing this gel, using those proteins in the AIDS test, in the HIV antibody test, wrongly claiming those are HIV-specific proteins. And if you bind against those proteins, you said you are HIV positive. But this is a circular argument because they produced, under very stressful conditions, those proteins. And imagine if your body, under very stressful conditions, produces the same proteins, your body reacts in building antibodies against those proteins, thus resulting in positivity. And of course, if you think about the hemophiliacs, which were since '69 were given prophylactically factor VIII preparation, which was forbidden before because they were afraid of antibody production against those factor preparations because they're very impure. Only 0.3% is pure activity. The rest is cellular debris, proteins, foreign proteins. There, all the liver diseases coming from in the case of hemophiliacs. And of course, this results in positivity. They have huge amounts of foreign proteins introduced to their body. The body makes antibodies against, and then they come up with a positive HIV test.
But to protect humans efficiently, stocks of defensive weapons must be manufactured in sufficient quantities. The industrial war machine for vaccine production must be launched to put a stop to the invisible invaders. The vaccine must then be distributed to the four corners of the globe. Unlike vaccines, viruses travel alone. Vaccines reinforce our body's defense.
I want you to say something about vaccines now.
The question about vaccines, look, if there is no virus, and if they can only detect by indirect means the presence of some proteins said to be specific for HIV, but expressed only under severe stress conditions, then to vaccinate, it means to make the thing worse. And of course, if there is no demonstration of the existence of such virus, it makes absolutely no sense to vaccinate.
The background of AIDS, and we are absolutely sure about this, is the antibiotic resistance catastrophe, killing people in hospitals like flies, because There are no antibiotics available without resistance in some bacteria. So in a state of immune suppression in the hospital, a lot of people come down with bacterial infections. This is called sepsis because of blood poisoning. When too much bacteria are growing and producing toxins, this is going to kill them in a state of reduced immunity. And we had these problems already in the beginning of the 70s. There have been kind of emergency conferences dealing with the problem because they were scared that resistance would spread and they have no antibiotica available. So they invented a very strong antibioticum, and it's not an antibioticum to say it's pure chemotherapy. It's a double folic acid antagonist. The good old sulfonamide and two of them put together would kill every microbe. AIDS started partly when they said that it's possible to measure the strength of the immune system, analyzing or counting T4 cells, the so to say helper cells. But that's not possible. And it has already been published in '81 in the journal JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, saying that it makes no sense to count subsets even of lymphocytes because there was never a correlation. It could be high or low and people are healthy or ill, it doesn't matter. So this was already known. But the problem was at this time already that in medicine people would not look to the facts but what is possible to sell on the market, because it was the year 1977 when it became possible to patent medical techniques. So they wouldn't care if there's any a clinical meaning behind those measurements, but they just sold it on the market. And the model of immunology would say at this time, if the immune system is weak, so cancer would appear. And that has been fundamentally mistaken, and it was wrong when they said it in '81. They knew it already in 1980 that this has been wrong. The immune surveillance theory of cancer came into existence when the war against cancer failed. And when, of course, he's stimulating the cell with all kind of mitogens, carcinogens, and he, of course, added hydrocortisone, which he hasn't published. But this matters. They added hydrocortisone like people under persistent stress, hypercortisolism, that the same proteins are produced. Think about Septrim, you know. The FDA says this should be given only 14 days maximum. Otherwise, your own blood picture is going to be destroyed irreversibly, means for the rest of the life, because the damages became inherited. Because it's Septrim, it's pure chemotherapy, it acts on a genetic level. This is why those kind of antibiotica are so effective, because they are destroying the genetic material of the bacteria, the damages are accumulating, and there is no repair. Humankind is in danger to destroy its own genetic material using this kind of antibiotica and chemotherapy, which would destroy the genetic material of our mitochondria. This is the name of those bacteria inside our cell producing the energy. And then we go lower and lower with energy production, and this is what we are seeing. And if we then have no regenerative power, then it becomes a big problem. What they have overseen, and that's a real catastrophe for all chronic disease, where the energy is produced inside our cells. These bacteria are so stable, integrated inside the cell, that a great deal of their own genetic material has been exported inside the nucleus, where there is protection of the genetic material better than in the bacteria themselves, but they have their own genetic material. That has been overseen. And now think about the antibiotics killing bacteria. They are killing our own energy plants inside the cell. And if the cell is not able to produce enough energy, it might die. So you go into persistent inflammatory conditions if the body has enough regeneration power to build up new cells, or the cell becomes cancerous using fermentation as its source of energy. And in the liver cells, we have most of the mitochondria present, 500 per cell. So that's the highest concentration of mitochondria. Of course, in egg cells of the women, we have 500,000. And it's of greatest importance for women due to completely different reason, because with every shot, with unnecessary shot of antibiotica, they would destroy their genetic material, which they would pass over to the offspring, because the mitochondria are only given to the next generation through the egg cell. It has been known already in the mid-70s. They knew when stress hormones are released, the immune functions are immediately suppressed, because when we are under stress and we have to run away because the lion is behind us, we need no immune functions and waste energy for the replication of immune cells. But the dangerous thing is when we have persistent stress, heavy stress, not like outside the streets, but heavy stress, right? Be it nutritional, be it toxic. Alcohol, poisons, yeah, and wrong malnutrition, you know, everything is causing the liver to suffer. The liver has a lot of regenerative power, means a lot of decay of cells when being absolute intoxicated, but that means a lot of cells inside your body. And if immune functions are suppressed, then antibodies are produced against your own proteins. But the most important immune functions are not to take care about foreign or not foreign invaders. This is to recycle your own body. 1% of your body mass, and this is an incredible high number, 10 high to the 12 cells have to be recycled every day. And if this is not possible anymore, then you are in a very bad condition, because your body's own proteins are going to endanger your own life, because they are poisonous if they are freely floating around inside your body, and fungal infections may grow on them. So you interfere on a very basic level of life, and it takes a time that you see the clinical outcome of these damages, destroying the kidney in the first line and other organs. But then, when they accumulate and would cause all various kind of effects.